everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Welcome to Another View. We're broadcasting live from Fort Monroe as preparations are underway for the commemoration of 400 years since the first enslaved Africans landed in English North America. They landed at a place called Point Comfort. Today, we know it as Fort Monroe here in Hampton, Virginia. On our program today, historian Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander and National Park Superintendent Terry Brown on why it's taken so long for history to catch up with truth and how America's original sin, slavery, still impacts our society today. Plus questions from our live audience. Stay with us. Another View is coming up next.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. We are honored to bring you today's show live from Fort Monroe, the site of the landing of the first enslaved Africans to English North America. It was 400 years ago, yet the ravages of slavery still impact us today. We'll talk about that with our guests, who I will introduce in just a moment. But first, a shout out to our live audience, 120 strong and still growing. Thank you so much. Yes. Come on, let the people hear you on the radio. There you go. We are so honored you came out in this heat, although we have a lovely shaded area where we are seated to enjoy today's programming. And we also want to say a very special hello to those of you listening to us on Richmond's NPR member station, VPM News 88.5 FM. So we are all over the Commonwealth of Virginia today. So thank you so very, very much for that. Joining me for today's Another View history lesson is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University and our resident historian on Another View, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Hey, Cassandra.
Hello. How are you? How's everyone?
And also joining us, he's the superintendent of the Fort Monroe National Monument, intimately involved in the planning of this commemoration and truly brings history to life. Please welcome National Park Superintendent Terry Brown.
Thanks.
I also want to give a shout out before we start our conversation to Delegate Cliff Hayes. He's with the 77th District in Chesapeake. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. We appreciate that very, very much. So, Cassandra, as I did the introduction, I said enslaved Africans to English North America, yes. And you wrote me a note. You take issue with framing it that way.
Yes, I do.
Let's talk about that.
Well, the primary reason I take issue with that is because those first 32, and there were about 32 people who arrived, both in late August and 3 or 4 days later, and we don't know the exact dates, but they arrived during that time, and it was about 32 people. Those were people who were kidnapped from their homes. They were not part of an internal slave trade in West Central Africa. Instead, they were kidnapped for the purpose of becoming slaves in the Spanish-American area. And so they were actually double kidnapped. So they were kidnapped off of the San Juan Bautista before it got to the Veracruz port in Mexico. And when they were brought here, they were actually in transition. So they were not enslaved. And in fact, once they got here to the Virginia colony, there was no system of slavery. And we would see in the first 20 years almost silence on that issue. Instead, we would see them listed in the records as servants. Now, is that to say that they were treated the same as white servants? No. There is clear evidence that the fact that they were not even named when they arrived, there was no ethnic association associated with them, but it was the case with all the white servants who arrived, whether they had contracts or whether some of them had actually been kidnapped and brought to servitude in Virginia, but they were still named. They still had an ethnic identity associated with their personhood, while none of the Africans did. In fact, we know there were about 17 women and 15 men who were here. And so there was even an imbalance in the numbers of the ratio between men and women, whereas the complete opposite was the case with the Europeans. Those who were here, they were overwhelmingly male, with only a small percentage of white women in the colony at that time, surrounded by a huge population of Native Americans. So when you're talking about that story, the story is the way that it is told in the history books, especially K through 12 history books, is very different than what actually occurred. And historians have been writing about this for many years, but it hasn't filtered down yet. And so these first Africans, like the case of John Punch in 1640, his sentence for running away was permanent servitude. If he was already enslaved, how can you have a punishment of permanent servitude if you're already permanently in servitude? And so that, combined with what we would see freedom suits, where people were saying, I'm a Christian, you can't hold me past my 20 years, we would see a lot of that happening in the 1640s, 1650s, 1660s, and on. So the system of slavery really didn't evolve in Virginia until the 1650s, 1660s, although Massachusetts would enact a slave law as early as 1641.
So even though they weren't legally and systematically enslaved, yet they were still treated.
They were treated
in that same
differently.
way and treated differently.
Yes.
So Terry, but the people who came here, I think sometimes the history books will say, well, they just came and they did what they were told. They had no skills. Is that true?
That's far from the truth. I mean, if we start with 1619, what I don't want to do is tell people that our history starts with 1619. The Africans that would arrive here had many skills. They knew how to cultivate rice, sugar, cotton. They were familiar with traditional trade routes. They had religion and laws that they were familiar with. This country would not have survived without the introduction of Africans in this space.
So why is it then that the history books don't talk about Point Comfort?
Well, I'll jump in with that. I mean, if you go to Massachusetts, you would think that the colony or the country started at Plymouth Rock in 1620.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that, starting in the 1830s, and I hate to provide these little history lessons, but starting in the 1830s,
we like the history lessons.
Yeah.
America was trying to frame itself with a single message. How do you combine all these different states together who came up differently? How do you get everybody on the same page? How do you have a single message? How do you brand America? And the leadership at that time decided to brand America with a Christian marker by saying that America began as a Christian nation. Now, it did not begin as a Christian nation, but that was the brand that was put forward starting in the 1830s. And the only place you could kind of say that would be Plymouth. And so that's why Jamestown and the Jamestown colony was erased from a lot of people's understandings of the emergence of this nation, because Jamestown started as a corporation. It did not start to give people an opportunity to start a new life and practice their own religious freedom. It started for people to make money, and they were hoping they would find gold and then go back to England. That was the real purpose of Jamestown as a colony starting. It was started to be a temporary settlement, but it ended up being a permanent settlement.
You want to add to that, Terry?
Well, yeah, who wins the war, write the story, right? So it's important that when we have this conversation, I'm thinking about the person that just simply don't know anything about us. So the American economy was produced with slave-grown crops: tobacco, sugar, rice, and finally cotton. Those products were sold to international colonies around the world to bring capital back to the colonies. That capital was used to build infrastructure that lasted for 3 centuries. In 1860, there were 4 million slaves in this country, and they were valued at $3 billion. Now, I want you to think about this. What they do is they take economic power and transfer it to political power. So when we start to create the central government in 1793, your first president is whom?
George
Washington.
Washington.
He owns people. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, all the way through Jackson. Don't let me forget Tyler, Polk, and Taylor.
And Abraham Lincoln.
And Abraham Lincoln. Thank you very much. And all your chief justices from the beginning of the Republic to the Civil War own people. John Marshall, Roger Taney. We have to educate the community in the world about how this country was created. And it was created with black and brown people in it. It would not have survived. And it's important that our history books start to reflect that. But it's hard to break that wall. You have to use a spatula these days to get through to the education system. We have to find a different way.
I like how you say they owned people.
Yes.
Because I think in the narrative, a lot of times we forget that these were human beings.
Yes.
These were people just like us who were forced to live a life and to work at the behest of others. And I think that that's just really important. So as you frame Fort Monroe, and you look at the idea of how the Africans arrived here, even among scholars, though, there's still debate over whether or not it happened here in Hampton or it happened in Jamestown, and so forth. Is there a point, and how do historians reconcile that, or are we going to be stuck with two different versions? Three different versions, 100 different versions.
5 different versions.
Yeah.
All right, so we have a tendency of working backwards in our understanding of things. So today, when we think of Jamestown, there's a specific place. It's located right next to Williamsburg, and it includes a remanufactured, reimagined fort, and then the area where they actually found where the fort existed. But that is not what they meant in 1619 when they said Jamestown. In 1619, Jamestown was the colony, and they were starting to use the word Jamestown and Virginia almost simultaneously or interchangeably. When they were referring to the fort, the Jamestown fort, they simply used the term the fort. When they were talking about New Jamestown, they would often say the town, because these were key areas and everybody understood what everyone meant. And the same thing is true for today. When we use certain references, we know what it means. We don't have to explain it because we're not thinking, okay, in 200 years or 400 years, will someone understand our references? And so it's because over time, Jamestown has taken a very specific location and dynamic. People misunderstand what folks were saying 400 years ago. But the reality is that John Rolfe said in his letter to John Smith that they arrived at Old Point Comfort. And so in my mind, that just settles this discussion. and so I want people to know, yes, they arrived at Jamestown, the Jamestown colony. But their point of entry was Old Point Comfort, which is right here at Fort Monroe.
We have with us in the audience former Delegate Glenn Oder, and he is the Executive Director of the Fort Monroe Authority. And you have a brand new visitor center that explains a lot of this.
Yes, we are going to be opening up as a preview showing this weekend a $9 million renovated building. It is the Fort Monroe Visitor and Education Center. For the first time at Fort Monroe, we're going to have a specific place where we welcome people to Fort Monroe. We orient them to all of the history of Fort Monroe. We also are going to be specifically talking about the Indians that were here first. They were here for a long time before we were. Nobody's ever told that story before. We're going to tell that story here. We're going to talk about these first Africans that landed. We like to use the word landed as opposed to arrived. The first Africans that landed here, again, nobody's told this story before. There was a question a moment ago about why not? One thing that we have to understand is that the Army cocooned this property for 200 years. And I like that term because they wrapped it up. They did all kinds of things to protect us and make sure that we were safe, but they didn't tell this story. And so now all of a sudden the property has reverted back to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we're sharing the property with the National Park Service, our partner. And so for the first time, we are going to tell this story. This is a generational opportunity that nobody's ever accepted before. In fact, I would say this is our generational responsibility for the first time to tell the whole truth about Point Comfort, about Fort Monroe, and maybe this becomes the pebble in the pond. The splash is this weekend. And then there's the concentric circles that radiate out from that splash. And it's our job, the National Park Service and the Fort Monroe Authority and our historians, to make sure that those ripples get bigger and larger and more vibrant and reach more and more people across the region, across our state, across the country, and eventually even internationally, so people recognize what actually occurred here on this property.
Well, one ripple that has definitely happened is that this has gotten national and international press. As a matter of fact, we want to say to you two, Terry, and to Cassandra, thank you for thinking of the little people. So y'all are doing all this national press.
I'm big time now.
However, the New York Times did an incredible expose on 1619, if you've had a chance to take a look. And there are some who say it's all a hoax.
The whole project is a lie. Look, I think slavery is a terrible thing. I think putting slavery in context is important. We still have slavery in places around the world today, so we need to recognize this is an ongoing story. This is a tragic decline of the New York Times into a propaganda paper worthy of Pravda or Izvestia in the Soviet Union.
It's always nice to see former speaker giving us his anti-slavery bona fides. Other conservatives, including the Washington Examiner's chief political correspondent Byron York, Fox News contributor, said it's really part of the New York Times agenda to target Trump. All of which prompts the question, what are they so afraid of? What is it about a deep and sustained study of one of the most important foundational institutions of the country that scares and offends them?
I think what a lot of conservatives want is they want to choose which parts of our past we remember and which parts of our past we forget. And I don't understand what people are so afraid of if we're simply revealing the truth about our country. My essay is actually probably the most patriotic thing I've ever written.
Yeah, it's all about how you came to love the flag.
Exactly. It is a story of redemption. It's just, I think what people are uncomfortable with is the people who are redeeming this country are the people who we've always considered to be a problem and on the bottom.
That was Newt Gingrich, the former House Speaker, Chris Hayes, MSNBC host, and Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the New York Times journalist who wrote the 1619 Project. Why are we fighting against this, Cassandra?
I think because our national narrative is at stake, the one that we've embraced forever. And that narrative was to justify the dominance of people of European descent in this country and their rightfulness to own and control and to govern this nation. And that's why there's been so much effort to claim to be the descendant of Pocahontas and John Rolfe. All of the FFVs of Virginia, and I know I'm stepping on toes here, but you know, that's about ownership. It's not, and with ownership comes authority. But in reality, if you really tell this story correctly, historically, with facts, undergirding everything that you say, then the issue is that this is a very complicated story. People don't behave as archetypes of evil or good. They're very complicated. And this messy story of the origins of America is as complicated as you can get. There was no grand plan in place. People were making it up. And you know, if you're watching the news today, you can tell people are making stuff up as they go along. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, this whole issue of how this colony was formed and the people who were in it, if they heard our story today, you know, if they read the national narrative today, they would wonder, who are we talking about? Because it does not resemble what happened. You know, up until recently, people thought that there were no Native Americans in any of the areas that were dominated by the English. Kicquetan, which is now downtown Hampton, or the Jamestown Fort, or New Jamestown, they would wonder, you know, what are you talking about? There are native peoples. They're finding remains of native peoples. When the English took over those areas, they didn't push everybody out who was there before. Some died from fighting, some died from disease, but those people stayed in those locations. But our narrative excises all people of color from that discussion. But I remember as a child having that awful Virginia social studies book that was taught to the 7th graders that said that black people, there was a red letter year. 1619 was a red letter year, yay, when slaves arrived in Virginia and when white women arrived in Virginia. And I'm trying to figure out what are they talking about?
Yeah.
That this is really good news, and many of the women who arrived, the white women, there were already some in the colony, but those who arrived, their story is even more complicated because not all of them who came here supposedly to marry white men and to produce children to create a white society, some of them chose not to marry. So the story is very, very different. But that textbook was awful because it also talked about how enslaved people were servants, were members of the family, that they were allowed to go to church and party on Saturday and go to church on Sunday and basically work 9 to 5. And even, those kinds of things have hurt the way that people have viewed this country and this narrative. So what I'm hearing from Newt Gingrich, and I really hate to say this, somehow he got a PhD in history at some point in his life, but I think he threw that out for politics and for political convenience. He's calling it a hoax because people are afraid that if the narrative changes, then their sense of ownership and privilege might also change when all of us are owners of America.
Mm-hmm. Terry, as an African American who is the superintendent of the Fort Monroe Monument of this park, what does this mean to you on a personal level in terms of being able to guide and direct what's going on here?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had my DNA done, and it revealed I was from Cameroon.
Oh, wow.
I'm so proud of that. It's not even funny. It's a very special thing. I mean, when I arrived here in 2016, I had no idea that this kind of day would show up. Imagine knowing you're from Cameroon and you drive across that bridge and you walk in this space where the first Africans landed. It's pretty special. I've cried a number of times just thinking about it. If you think about the arc of history, they land here and, it's a world unknown. Right? They don't know what the next step is going to be. But if you look behind me, there's the largest stone fort in the United States surrounded by water. And it was built in part by enslaved people. And at that same fort is where the contraband decision was made. Mm-hmm. That would lead to the Emancipation Proclamation. And who would have ever thought that the first black president, would make a portion of this fort a national monument? And just to put the cherry on top, he also produced the first black superintendent. So the reason why the National Park Service is so important in this space is that when we established this space as a national monument in 2011, we were actually very intentional. Me and Glenn, the state, and the city, we were very intentional about making sure that we don't wait 75 years to start telling this story. We're going to engage now. If you visit Fort Monroe, we're going to talk about slavery, race, Jefferson Davis. Oh, by the way, my office is the former home of Robert E. Lee. Oh, yeah, we're going to have conversations.
There.
So when we open up the visitor center, it is, yes, a visitor center, but it's an opportunity to interpret, to allow for us to have dialogue. Mm-hmm. In this country, I cannot drive up to a gas station and go, hey, you want to talk about race? It doesn't work like that. You can do that in a museum. You can do that in a national park. That's where health and growth can take place. So I encourage you to come back. You need to come back here on the anniversary, August 25th, because that's home. And you got to pay attention to your
ancestors. And I want
ancestors.
you to talk about some of the things that are going to be happening there. But if you're just joining us, we're broadcasting live from historic Fort Monroe, the place where the first Africans arrived in English North America 400 years ago. My guests are historian and dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, and superintendent of the Fort Monroe National Monument, Mr. Terry Brown. So, Terry, tell us a couple of things this whole weekend you've got a lot of things happening.
Oh, my goodness.
So give us kind of a rundown of what people can expect and encourage people to come on
Well,
out.
if you're sitting at home, shame on you, because all week we've been having events. I mean,
Yeah.
Hampton University has been putting on events. The city, the state of Virginia, the National Park Service. We're having poetry and concerts all week. But everything culminates with Saturday and Sunday. On Saturday, we're going to give you a chance to peek inside that new visitor center. It's in honor of you. And that's white, black, and green. It's for you. And we're going to do that for you. And we're going to have events out here all day. And later on that night, there's a free concert with the sounds of blackness and Common. Actually, Common. I want his autograph. How about you? And then on Sunday, every time I think about it, I get emotional because we're going to have a national bell ringing in honor of our ancestors. And we're going to ring bells for 4 minutes, 1 minute for every century. And I think this is an opportunity for the nation to pay their respects to our ancestors. I'm just getting goosebumps thinking about it because we're going to ring that bell right out here to my left. It's very exciting. So please come out. Later on that night, we're going to end everything with a gospel concert.
So a lot of things going on.
Yes.
We also have joining us in our audience, Jeffrey Blair with Remember the 400. And you have some programs happening here on at Fort Monroe, too, on Saturday, correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. I just want to say I'm so happy to be here. I am part of the Remember the 400 national movement, and some of the things that were mentioned about education as far as being a ripple effect in the pond. I'm from St. Louis. And Remember the 400 have people that are kind of from Toronto, from the UK and Canada, from New York, from Atlanta, from all over, because we want to be part of this national movement of this conversation, especially concerning the youth. We have to be able to tell the right story to the next generation so they can understand that foundation to make good decisions going forward as they start to help to build this society as well. And so that movement started by Shadrach Porter. And over this past year in our local areas, local chapters, we've been having programs to bring awareness to this milestone. Most people have no idea about this 400-year milestone. And so it's good to be a part of this movement so that we can bring awareness to that and tell the right story. I was told the same thing in my history books about the non-existence of African Americans in any significant way in building this country. And I can't tell that lie to my children. And I want to be part of a movement that's going to tell the story right so they can understand the truth about who they are and where they come from.
Is there something going on for children tomorrow?
Absolutely.
Okay, tell us very quickly what that is.
So this actually tonight is going to be the Journey play that's happening at the American Theater. And then tomorrow we'll be a part of the youth program called I Am More event. The I Am More event. It's going to be down in the youth section. And there's going to be spoken word. There's going to be performances. There's going to be a series of booths that are going to talk about a history where people can come and receive a passport, go through the various booths. Black inventors, prior to enslavement, like you said, it's not just 400 years, but even before that, we were a people, right? And so all the things that we've done in different kingdoms that were highlighted even before we got here. But even during our 400-year period, what were some of our freedom fights like? It's not this narrative of the docile slave who just took it, but the many fights for freedom that we had along many different ways. For instance, I'm from St. Louis. One of the big fights was the Dred Scott decision, right? Where we had individuals who were trying to fight, not just physically, but even through the legal system. And many were successful in actually getting their freedom through that way. And so we're also going to have, but not just looking to the past, because we're focused on the youth, we also want to empower them with the truth so they can start thinking about how do we solve the problems of today to build a better tomorrow. So we're going to be highlighting youth entrepreneurs. We're going to be highlighting individuals who are doing great things even in the political sphere. And so we want to really focus on the youth to make sure they have all the tools they have in order to be successful and be building this world.
Okay, thank you so much. That's Remembering the 400. So, Cassandra and Terry, where were you when we commemorated the 200 and the 300? You remember?
Not born.
But my point is, why the 400? Why now?
It is 2019. And, for 400 years, America has been on this journey. And while there have been significant strides forward, we have seen also a pulling back. But, once President Barack Obama was elected president, it gave the world a sense of the possibilities. And you cannot kill that imagination of possibilities. And that possibility is that we don't have to stay in a racialized society. And so now we have people fighting to remain there, and we have people fighting to move forward. And I think this gives us an opportunity to reflect. It gives us an opportunity to go a different course, because one of the things we haven't done is break the pattern, that muscle memory of racialism in our law, in our society, in our culture, in our economy, et cetera, et cetera. What I mean by that, 1669, Virginia, that legislature that started a month before the Africans landed here, that legislature in 1669 passed a law that allowed for the, quote, casual killing of black people by their owners if they resisted in any way. 3 years later, that legislature passed a law allowing for any white person to kill any black person who resisted in any way. Does that sound familiar? When you have that particular law put in place, it becomes part of our cultural and legal landscape. There's been nothing to do that we've done to break that pattern of behavior, that particular way of thinking. And now we have an opportunity because people are bringing it to the forefront. And there's a thing called a smartphone that is documenting a lot of things that before it was my word against a police officer's word, and my word was not valued as much. Now we have a different dynamic, and there are many more people who do not want to see this pattern of racialism continue in our society. So this year, 2019, with all commemorations, it allows the population a time to reflect and to think about who we really want to be moving forward.
So, Terry, what happens in 2020? What's going to happen with all of this?
Yeah, it definitely cannot stop just in 2019. Well, I'm just looking at your audience. It's pretty mixed.
Yeah, which is great.
Which is a good signal for what direction we're heading in. And I think, the more we gather and talk, the easier it is to break down the insidiousness of racism. And I think change is hard. It takes a long time. I mean, let me do the word long, real long. Long time for change to happen.
Yeah.
But I believe there's more good people than bad. I mean, it's so easy to focus on the negative. When we have an event like this, it's so easy to go, nope, that's for them, not for me. But I think there's a wide swath of people that are looking at history and looking at other cultures like they need to be a part of it too. They don't want their kids to grow up in a world that is complex and they're not able to say I'm sorry and work out problems. I think the world is opening up a little bit. In 2019, I think there's more opportunities to say, hello, I want to be a part of your experience. I want to learn more about your experience. I also think technology plays a role too, and you hit on that a little bit. But I also want to send a message to all of you. Black people are very beautiful. I'm one of them. Look at me. They're very beautiful. And we come from some really beautiful... I remember watching my mother cook in the kitchen, and I used to stare at her and think, wow, that's amazing. See, you have to remember, when Africans come here, they're under the most oppressive conditions imaginable. But they managed to reinvent themselves. They reclaimed their heritage. Not just surviving slavery, but creating these fresh and vibrant responses to American democracy. Guess what they ended up doing? They created new art forms, new music, new families, new languages. They were truly remarkable. And all I'm doing as a superintendent in this uniform is trying to say to America, look at me evenly. This is not just African American history, it is
American history.
American history.
Absolutely. We have any questions from our audience? Who has the question? Lisa, there she's gone, ran to the back. We'll come get you in just a moment.
Well, first of all, I'm so glad we're having this conversation today, and I'm glad we're having this conversation here, and I've enjoyed every bit of it. So I teach early American literature and history at Old Dominion University. And I have to say, this conversation, because I want to bring this conversation into the classroom, and I have been having it in the classroom, but it is evolving and changing so quickly sometimes, it is really hard to even keep up with it. And so I want to throw this back at Dr. Newby-Alexander. The idea of just in terms of terminology, what do we use? And this idea that we shouldn't use the term enslaved people when we're talking about these first people from Africa who were brought here against their will. And I'm thinking that Jamestown didn't happen in a vacuum, that slavery was happening in the Western Hemisphere, that these practices were well known, and that there were people in the Jamestown colony in 1619 who had come from Bermuda and other places, and they knew about slavery. So even though the laws weren't codified, wouldn't it still be accurate to say that it was being practiced? It just wasn't being called that necessarily. And then, does it just confuse the matter not to use that term? So I guess that's my question.
Yeah, and that's a very good question. In fact, a lot of historians are making this particular argument that, because the English knew that slavery was practiced in a lot of other areas, of course, in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies and so forth, that yes, it makes sense that they would be called enslaved people. But my argument is that we have a lot of examples of people who were brought to this colony who were not enslaved, who got their freedom after 20 years. You have Anthony Johnson and his wife Mary, who were on the Bennett plantation, and they came in 1623-24. They got their freedom after 20 years and got land on the eastern shore and became very prosperous landowners there, as did their descendants. You had Anthony and Isabella here in Kickingham and Hampton, and their child, William Tucker, who was named after the owner, was the godchild. And that has a very different implication when you're in the court record saying you're the godparent of a child. That child takes on your status. You are the protector of that child, and his owner was free. His owner was a white man. And so that suggests also that this child was not enslaved. And according to some of the records that I have seen, Anthony and Isabella received their freedom as well after years of servitude, because in the English system, you had servants. You had indentured servants and you had servants. Indentured servants had contracts that could last anywhere from 2 to 10 years. Servants were those without contracts, and because England did not allow for slavery among anybody who was a Christian, the maximum time was 20 years that you could hold that person in bondage. And I mentioned the John Punch case, so there are other question marks. There are other examples in the cases that lets us know that was, even if some people did hold people or try to hold people permanently in bondage, we saw resistance even to that with the freedom suits. And so it was not agreed upon collectively that there was a system of slavery in place. So I prefer the term bonded or unfree, because it was a very fluctuating and fluid situation at that time, and I prefer to lean on the side of caution, not to simply make it simple and say they were enslaved, because there are too many occasions when that story doesn't apply to everyone.
Yes, tell us with your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Ra Osalaj. I'm from Appomattox County, where the nation was reunited, but I live in Hampton now. I've called in once before, last year. It's great to be here. It's great to be a part of this actual event. I'm just curious, we're talking about having conversations and being able to, kind of carry that conversation forward. Just as a normal person, it's kind of difficult to figure out how to broach that topic, right? And so I'm wondering, as part of this weekend, are there advices that either you can give, or perhaps part of some of the events that are giving recommendations on how to have those conversations? And then also, would that kind of thing be discussed as part of the Welcome Center?
Okay, Terry?
Well, for the first time, Glenn and I are putting together a Black cultural tour that will go out every year. And on Saturday, we will provide tours that will explain the story of the African-American experience in this space. And it's all designed to create dialogue. And we were very intentional about making sure that this story stays in place for the rest of our duration. I think when it comes to how to have a conversation, this space, look, I work for the National Park Service. My job is to protect national resources, right? So why is the superintendent talking about race and slavery and all that? Because we protect some of the greatest resources around the country. Did you know the White House is managed by the National Park Service? Yeah. Statue of Liberty, Everglades, Grand Canyon, and now Fort Monroe. But when we protect these places, there's stories associated with them. So we have to go out and talk about this stuff. It's interesting, when I put on the Superman suit and I start talking about race and slavery, there's a certain comfort zone that I have. There's an advantage I have over you because the brand that I wear, they trust it, right? They know there's a little comfort zone there. Just walking up on the street.
You're an authority.
I'm authority, right? So it's an art form. It's an art form. It's very hard. I'm not saying that it's easy, but here's what I would encourage all of us to do. I'm going to buy myself a diary starting Sunday, and I'm going to track my experiences over the next year. And when we have this event next year, I want to see what you have in your book, and let's see if we can improve our society. What are you doing? Please document. I would love to see it. I think there's a way to have a discussion in that manner and bring people in a circle to do that. It's just a small sample.
You want to give some ideas on how you approach the topic?
Well, I think that this topic, it can solicit emotions. It can, especially an emotional response that could be positive or negative. But I think when you have this conversation, it has to be undergirded with facts, with history, with not accusations, but with what actually happened. But people come to the table with their own emotions and with wanting to either preserve what they believe, what has been a part of their lives, or they come wanting to learn. And so it really is, the teacher in me is always about, okay, so this is really what happened. And let's understand where you're coming from so that we can have a dialogue. I'm not accusing you because you weren't alive during that period unless you have a secret to tell. So, right. So none of us should have a dog in that fight, except the fight should be, let's tell the truth. Let's base our understanding on fact. Let's base our understanding on what, as much as we can uncover what actually happened at that particular time.
I also want to encourage African Americans who talk to other African Americans about this history. Yeah. Because we need to learn our own history so that, before we can get into a fight with somebody else about, what happened or what didn't happen, we need to know ourselves. And so a lot of times the conversation about race may not necessarily be between a black person and a white person or a black person and another minority. It is between us, and we've got to know the correct history. We have another question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Kendall Crawford. I was born and raised here in Hampton Roads, grew up in Hampton. I'm the director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, so we work to make sure that we are moving towards environmental justice, clean air, clean water, safe and stable climate, and access to land. So my question is, when slavery ended, there was a promise made for 40 acres and a mule. And it seems like, I'm not a history professor, but it does seem like some slave owners were compensated. So I'd like to know what your opinions are on reparations, especially Dr. Newby-Alexander. Thank you.
We only got 10 minutes left, okay?
All right. I have for a very long period of time been in favor of reparations, but not in terms of paying an individual, because I think it's like the indentured servitude. When they had head rights, which was that once you finish your years of service, you got land, because land doesn't go away. Unless it goes into a sinkhole. Land stays with you. Whereas if you give somebody money, that can be spent and you have nothing left after that. And so I'm in favor of reparations that will go and make sure that the schools, for example, are at par, so that we have the best schools. And especially in the communities of color that have historically been oppressed, that historically have been impoverished. We need the best teachers in those areas. We need to bring us up to an equitable level, because we still have a lot of inequity. When I look at a lot of the schools that are 70, 80, 90% African American or Hispanic, for that matter, those schools were built in the 1940s and 50s. Those schools are completely inadequate to date, and I don't care what kind of renovation you have. So I'm supportive of community centers. I'm supportive of making sure that people who are at that middle class level and below, that their children do not, and the parents do not have to pay for college tuition, that their children are being given the same amount of opportunity that many groups have had for centuries. And I'm also in favor of not only cutting out all this redlining that goes on, but also making sure that young entrepreneurs, older entrepreneurs who are African American, who get turned down all the time for business loans, have a pot of money to pull from, as well as financial education as to how to set up a business, how to operate that business. So to me, there are lots of opportunities for reparations. And when General Sherman made that declaration of 40 acres and a mule, people forget that African Americans in this area and other places throughout the South that were occupied by the Union government paid money for land that was abandoned by the Confederates. And when Andrew Johnson came into office, he restored that land to the white Confederates without compensating the blacks for what they paid for that land. So and that was before the 13th Amendment was passed. So, it was right after the 13th Amendment was passed. So we really have to see the larger spectrum, because we have such an ignorance about the past because of how the basic narratives have been constructed for the general population to consume, that we really don't know. And I'm an advocate that Black history is American history, because when you think about the things that define us the most, or hey, in the South, we have Black cuisine, African American cuisine, and we have Southern cuisine. Let me ask you, what is the difference? It is, but Southern cuisine has been food that has been appropriated from African Americans and cast as white Southern food, when it is actually African American cuisine.
Yes, go ahead, Lisa. You have another question?
Bailey from Portsmouth, and hello
Hi, Sherry.
to Terry.
Hi, Sherry Bailey.
Hey, she's a superstar.
Yes, she is.
I wanted to let folks know that we have a replica of the boat that was used by the Contraband 3 in 1861, and tomorrow we will bring it down here to this area here and have you have an opportunity to see what it looked like, because those three men were the ones who initiated freedom for all enslaved people by what they did, their actions. They got a rowboat in Norfolk, came across the water, and went into the Union camp and asked Butler for asylum. They may not have used that word, but that's what they did. And that was the beginning of freedom. That was on May 23rd, 1861. And by June 8th, you had dozens, then hundreds of people showing up here claiming citizenship for American citizenship. And these were African American folks. So this is the amazing history that we have here. And we are really fortunate to have Terry Brown and Cassandra Newby-Alexander as stewards of what we are learning about what this history is here. And this is like a profound opportunity for America to refocus and to reconstruct and do what we were starting off to do in 1776, which is like freedom for all. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you for sharing that. So, Terry, a lot going on. Is there a cost? Is there a fee for people, or can people just come?
It's about $1,000 per person. No, it's absolutely free. We wouldn't charge you a dime for this. We're honored to host this for you, and I speak for the state of Virginia, the Fort Monroe Authority, the city of Hampton, of course, the National Park Service. And what I want you to walk away with is I want you to be a better person than when you arrived here. I want you to leave here inspired to make this country a lot better. We've had a tough history. It really is tough, but it's not the end. And just appreciate African-American contributions. That's all I'm asking for. I love this fort. I love the people of this community, and I'm very proud of what we're doing here. Good job.
You know, Cassandra, one of our most popular shows is when we do these history shows. There's a hunger for understanding.
I agree, even though I always say, oh, people don't want to hear the history, but they really do want to hear the history. They just don't want to hear it droned on. They don't want it as a lecture. They want a conversation, and they want the connections to be made. It's just like, Terry talked about some of his ancestry coming from the Cameroons. If your family has been from Virginia, especially this region, or Eastern North Carolina, more than likely, your family is from that region of the Cameroons and West Central Africa, and that's the area we're talking about these first Africans came from. So that means that you may actually be a descendant of some of those individuals who came to Virginia in the 17th century. And by the way, I also have ancestry from that region.
Really? Yes. Look at that. That's why we're sitting here together.
Yes. We're going to try to get one more question in before we have to go. We can't hear. The lady with the mic.
Hi.
Okay.
I wanted to. The moderator said about reparation. The definition of reparation in.
Okay, I believe she was asking about reparations. Oh, okay. Apparently the mic is too far in the back, so that's why it's not picking up. You were asking about the definition of reparations?
No, what I'm saying is reparations in our time has been defined as monetary. So far, reparations paid to, say, Japanese, reparations paid to the Indians, reparations paid to the Italians.
We're almost out of time,
These were
ma'am.
monetary reparations. They were not given to them in school improvements and and that kind of stuff. When we say reparations means to repair. And if you can't define how we are repaired, black people have to define how they are repaired.
Right. Okay. And the question was, how did I see reparations? And of course, when you talk about Native Americans, it was to their collective.
Okay. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, we are just about out of time. The hour has flown by. And so, Terry, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. And you too, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander and Terry Brown. And thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. If you'd like to hear this show again or share it with a friend, visit our website, anotherviewradio.org, and download the podcast. Sign up for our eView newsletter. It's a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. Check us out on Facebook, and you can find me on Twitter at Barbara Ham Lee. Next week on Another View, we talk about African-American philanthropy, how black people are finding innovative ways to give back to the community. Please come out to Fort Monroe this weekend. There are activities for the entire family. Come learn the history, celebrate African-American heritage and culture, and join together as we all reflect on ways that we can close the racial divide in this country. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Todd Washburn is our audio engineer with some help from our good friend Victor Bowen and also Ray Lentz. Our intern is Bobby Fuller. A very special thank you to our live audience here at Fort Monroe and to all of you on the radio, including brand new listeners on Richmond's NPR member station, BPM News 88.5. Thank you, everyone, so much for listening to Another View.